So, as I was saying, the Germans were forced to surrender, and many of them did not really see this as a surrender. A lot of them still wanted to fight because that was kind of the spirit that had been bred into them. But after the closure of the war, you had the Paris Peace Conference, which began in January 1919 and went until 1920. And there was a lot of propaganda from the Allied nations that made the Germans seem terrible, like terrible people, all of them, and almost like monsters even. However, Woodrow Wilson stepped into this peace conference, and his views were a little bit different and actually shed some light on the Germans. And he didn't really look at like what they did as a surrender. He looked at more as a settlement to end the war, and he tried to shed a better light on the Germans. And he did acknowledge that Germany was still the strongest state on the continent of Europe, which that was something that the other European countries had kind of not acknowledged and they had put down, and so they did not want to give Germany any recognition. They wanted to strip Germany of all their powers, which is ultimately what ended up happening. There ended up being the Peace of Paris Treaty from this conference, and it separated many states. Austria and Hungary were separated, and it resulted in huge losses of land for both nations and resources. The Ottoman Empire was broken up, and the Habsburg Empire was made into Czechoslovakia, Poland, the Kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. So, and then also the major part of the Paris Peace Treaty was the Treaty of Versailles, which basically talked about how the world was going to deal with Germany. The Allied forces were sent to occupy west of the Rhine in Germany. Germany was to pay massive reparations to other European nations. The German army was greatly reduced. The Navy, a lot of the ships were sunken in the German Navy, and the Navy was almost non-existent anymore. Germany was ordered to stop manufacturing offensive weapons. Germany was ordered to give coal to Belgium and France each year, and that massive amounts of coal, which probably devastated the German economy because they relied on their coal. They were not allowed to develop an air force in a time when many other nations were developing air forces because the invention of airplanes was still fairly new. And Germany's colonies were taken away from them. So, as a result, of course, Germany was left with a broken economy. With all this money that they owed to other nations, they were left with practically nothing, which left their people with practically nothing. They started actually printing their own money, which of course caused humongous inflation. And it was quoted in The Making of the West on page 759 that wheelbarrows of money were required to buy a turnip. So only a turnip, and they were shoveling massive amounts of paper to do that. They couldn't pay their war debts because of this inflation, and their money was of no value. So they couldn't pay their war debts to like France and Britain and other nations. And actually, France and Britain were struggling greatly at the time too because they had used so many resources for the war also. And they actually owed the United States for the help and the aid that the United States had sent in during the war before the United States decided to get involved. So not only could Germany not pay them, but they could not pay the United States. And so a lot of the European countries were pretty broken and poor. In addition to broken economies, there was the issue of how to make peace last. And so I think a few years later, they decided to return Germany to the community of nations and get Germany a little bit more involved in what was going on in the world again. But just throughout the 1920s, there was a lot of political unrest due to a lot of the economic unrest in many countries, not just Germany. Refugees were fleeing in places like Russia and getting away from the country because there was a lot of nationalism still going around. New nations that had formed as a result of other nations being broken up after the Great War were pushing out minority groups. And so people were wandering with no place to go and with people of the same like as them. And also in 1929, the US stock market crashed. So that was kind of the icing on the cake of all the broken economies, and even the United States fell then. The war had greatly militarized the world. I mean, just all this new weaponry had spread vastly with the World War. I mean, it involved many nations in the world, so just the world was very militarized now. And a lot of radicals started to, take hold in countries that were looking for someone to turn to. And many independent, strong men came to power and took advantage of these people who were looking for leadership to lead them and their countries out of the hole that they were in. So, like in the Soviet Union, they had many leaders that came about. Stalin came later in World War II. Italy had Mussolini, who was a great big leader in Italy, and he, excuse me, Mussolini started to bring rise to the people and develop new economic forms there, as well as Hitler coming along in Germany, who was probably the more well-known leader that emerged in that time of the 20s and 30s. And Hitler offered a lot of hope to Germany. He was actually a really great speaker, and he offered a lot of hope as far as like revenge and economic prosper, and he really promised the German people that he would rebuild their country, which was very appealing at a time when they had nothing. So Germany kind of comes out of World War I and the Great War, and a lot of other nations do too that were broken up, such as Austria and Hungary and the Ottoman Empire and all the smaller nations. And there's a lot of unrest in Europe and France as well.